Welcome. My name is Heather Clausen, and I am the Chief Program and Innovation Officer with Communities and Schools National Office, and will be moderating our panel on equity and student re-engagement. These are extraordinary times for our nation's children. When school buildings closed a year ago, more than 50 million students lost access to their physical classrooms and learning was disrupted. More importantly, they lost connections with teachers, counselors, coaches, and other caring adults who helped support their social and emotional well-being. Although some schools are now slowly returning to full-time in-person instruction, and teachers are becoming more adept at remote teaching, students are still reporting feeling disconnected from their support networks and disengaged from the learning process. Many students are failing behind in their classwork and struggling to catch up. Some estimates suggest that less than a third of high school students are on track to graduate, and an estimated 3 million students have fallen off the radar since last spring with no engagement at all in their learning. These statistics are horrifying for any student, and yet it is our Black, Brown, and Indigenous students who are once again disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and the inequities that persist within our education system. So what can we do now, and how do we reimagine the future of schools to create more equitable outcomes for all students, regardless of their learning environments, their race, gender, zip code, or background? Joining us today are Ray Saldana, the President and CEO of Communities and Schools, David Osher, Vice President and Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research, and Whitney Cole, a site coordinator focused on student and family engagement with Communities and Schools of Southern Nevada. Welcome, everyone. So Ray, I'd like to begin with you. Communities and Schools has been at the forefront of this national conversation around the need for an intentional focus on re-engaging students in their learning. For folks who are unfamiliar with Communities and Schools, can you talk briefly about the organization's work and share with us how the CIS network has responded to the pandemic by focusing on the re-engagement of students in their learning?
Well, thank you for the question, Heather, and for the opportunity to address an audience who may know Communities and Schools because we are partners with you as educators in your existing schools, and maybe you're eager to find out how we are adapting to the world during and after COVID. Or perhaps you don't know anything about Communities and Schools, but you know the concept behind our work, I assure you. But we are a national nonprofit organization working in 26 states and the District of Columbia, serving 1.8 million students in 2,900 schools across the country. What we do is very simple. We place a trained adult in schools in cooperation with our school partners to develop strong enough relationships with students, working with partners that exist in the community, working with school leadership to ensure that we are building a relationship with students. It is our founder who says that it is not programs that change young people's lives, it's relationships. And that's what site coordinators like the site coordinator who's joining us on the call today, Whitney Cole, do. And that is the secret to our work. We just happen to do this now in 2,900 schools across the country. And the work that we do is really we call them site coordinators for a reason. They're working not just to develop a relationship with students, but to ensure that all of the assets that exist in a community, whether those are other nonprofits, agencies to help with healthcare, with food insecurity, with access to mental health courses, or even just college access, that those are available to students in a world that oftentimes plays a difficult hand for students who are living in poverty or students who are being disproportionately impacted, not just by this pandemic, but disproportionately impacted by the way we have built schools. At Communities and Schools, we believe that in the absence of someone like Whitney as a site coordinator navigating a student through all of the barriers that exist, and what we know from the research and the headlines that disproportionately is impacting our students who are Black and Brown you need to have somebody at the center of a student's life, but not just anyone, somebody who's developed a relationship with that young person. And at Communities in Schools, we've been doing this work for now 44 years in that pursuit of how to truly do work that we call integrated student support, which is an evidence-based model that psych coordinators use to not only assess where a student is on their academics or behavior or attendance, but as we're going to hear about a little bit today, is now what does it look like for us to not just engage these students, make sure that they are showing up for virtual class or showing up for in-person learning that is occurring, but how do we ensure that we track something much more important, which is their social connection, their emotional connections to school, their cognitive connections to the school work, and create deeper relationships. There is a science behind this work. And I want to just sort of take a moment to step back, because there is an evidence base, there is data that we use with our psych coordinators. But I want to tell you a quick story. That's not how I found Communities in Schools. I wasn't looking from a drop-down menu of the nonprofits who had the highest return on ROI or had 3 decades worth of evidence-based research. For me, I found Communities in Schools because I found Ms. Reyes. She was my psych coordinator. And I certainly know that what it's like growing up in these communities that we care about, that our schools are tucked into, that oftentimes suffer from generational poverty. In my own case, because as I was a first-generation American struggling with making sure that I was acculturated to the school, but I also had aspirations. And our psych coordinators working in schools are ensuring that students can write their own success story, like I've been able to do now as a product of this program, being the first in my family to graduate from college, being in elected office. This is a version of my life that isn't possible without developing a relationship with an adult who cares for me and helps me walk through what can oftentimes be a dark time. And this, by no measure, is a time that is not dark for many of our students. And educators are going to be asked to do so much before they're asked to grapple with the learning loss that's happened over the last year. It's going to be asking our educators and principals to do work around, can you be school psychologists and social workers? We at Community Schools believe we have a role to play to unburden educators in working and focusing on those non-academic issues and concerns that sometimes hold a student back. And today I'm excited that we get to not only talk about the work and the evidence that we've created over 3 decades, but talk about how we're going to improve on the design. There is a small cadre of researchers who've been working on the mind science, the social emotional learning and development that happens with students, or oftentimes does not happen when they are engaging or disengaged. And in that reason, so grateful that we have found a partner like David Osher at the American Institute of Research, who has helped put tools in the hands of our psych coordinators who've already developed relationships with students and now their families through porch visits during the pandemic. And it's about making our psych coordinators better at the work that they are doing. So grateful that we are doubling down, not just on how to engage students, but now the re-engagement effort and using real research, evidence, and science to ensure that we are doing that with the American Institute of Research.
Thank you, Ray, and we'll hear a little bit more about that from David. So David, turning to you now, as Ray mentioned, you and your team have been working with CIS since last summer as we co-developed new tools to help us better understand this concept of engagement and engaging in learning. David, from your experience and years of research, why should we focus on engagement? Why engagement? Why now? And what do you think and what do you believe needs to happen in our schools moving forward for better engagement to be possible?
Thank you, Heather, and thank you, Ray, for the good thoughts. We know from research that from the adult perspective, relationship is the key. And what we also know is that from the young person's learning, their ability to engage in the learning process, to engage in learning and schooling is the key as well. While I've done lots of work with other people for decades, when Communities in Schools asked us to do this work, we were thrilled because we thought that the questions that were being asked were correct. It was not just about what do we do to get young people back in schools? What do we get them? What do we do to make sure that when they get back in schools, they can learn and participate? And that's important both because even before COVID, the issues of the types of young people with all their strengths that Ray's talking about in our schools, many young students of color don't have the opportunities to be engaged. That the notion of what type of learning we provide for them tends to be very, very behavioral and very, very scripted without addressing the fact that engagement in the learning process is very important. And so we were thrilled when communities and schools asked us to do the work with them. What we did was, on the one end, first, based on our research and the research of many other people, we developed a model of engagement. And engagement has 4 big elements. One that we tend to always count is behavioral engagement. But if you think about your learning, just being in a classroom or on a computer screen doesn't mean you're learning. There are other pieces. There's emotional engagement. How do you feel about the learning process? You know, is it interesting? Does it excite you? I feel and therefore I learn, some neurobiologists tell us, and I think they're right. Are you cognitively engaged? And that is whether or not you're really focused and involved in your learning. My granddaughter, when I once asked her about what teachers could do, said, engulf us in learning. I think she got the right word. Whether it's engulfment or whatnot, you want students to really be involved in the learning, that the way we see young people outside of school try to learn a skill. And there's social engagement. And what we've been hearing, particularly from young people in this year, is how lonely they are, how they don't feel like they're connected to other people. So we developed that model, which was not a revolutionary model. It's grounded in the best science. And then what we did with communities and schools is we had conducted focus groups with young people, with their families, and with their teachers to be able to understand how they define those 4 constructs. We also met with CIS staff to make sure that we could provide resources about how young people experience those 4 elements in ways that are actionable for people like Whitney. And then what we did is we used our best experience, and in this case, it was good experience doing, for me, 500 focus groups, for AIR as a whole, thousands and thousands of focus groups and interviews. How can one create a good interview protocol and at the same time using good scientific techniques to develop a simple survey and a database to provide support for educators, including CIS staff, in using the data? So that, I hope that is sufficient, Heather.
Yes, thank you, David. So Whitney, we're so glad you could join us. You know, you just heard Ray and David talk about this work and this issue of engagement, and it's sometimes easy for us at the national office and for researchers to talk about challenges and throw out ideas around solutions for improving student outcomes. But you are actually living through the pandemic with your students and families and confronting these challenges related to inequality and engagement firsthand. And we'd really like to hear from you about what engaging students in their learning, what does that look like in practice? Specifically, what are you and your colleagues at Communities and Schools of Southern Nevada seeing as the challenges to engaging students in their learning? And secondly, what are you doing to help get and keep students engaged in the learning process? So first, what are the challenges? And then what is it you're actually doing that's working?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you, Heather and everyone, just for having me here today. It's always an honor. You know, I really wanted to focus first and acknowledge the fact that most of our students and families were already at a disadvantage pre-pandemic. And then COVID-19 came in and kind of just shined like a brighter spotlight on some of those holes and gaps that we were already working to fill. You know, I remember in the beginning stages of the pandemic, going into the stores and seeing like the shelves aisle by aisle just being empty. And I would think, well, what are my students doing, you know, that have no transportation to be able to get in those lines, to be early, to just get essentials, you know, something as basic as tissue or washing detergent. It was a struggle, you know, engagement was low. And then we had to ask the question of, well, why are students, you know, not engaged in learning right now? And we figured out that a lot of students didn't have food, you know, they didn't have transportation, they didn't have laptops, they didn't have Wi-Fi. So we had to figure out, how are we going to get our students connected? There were so many students just in the Clark County district alone who just weren't connected to those resources. And here in Southern Nevada, it was really a collective effort that we put together. There were a lot of people at the top who really just cared, and they put a lot of initiatives out. You know, one of the first initiatives that I was a part of was Delivering with Dignity, which was actually an initiative kind of like a DoorDash style approach to delivering food to those more susceptible to COVID-19. That was something that, you know, I was really happy to take part in. In the beginning, like I said, we were out there with gloves and masks, and we were in the community delivering food, doing check-ins with our students, because phone calls just weren't enough. You know, you try to reach out to families, and you're not hearing back from them. So then you go knock on doors, and then you're hearing from neighbors like, hey, that family moved because they couldn't afford rent anymore. So people were losing their jobs. It was really tough. It was things that we were seeing that, you know, I thought I would never see, even though we were already working in these underserved communities. This pandemic really shined a light, like I said, on some of those things that we were dealing with. And like David said, you know, working with these students, you have to get more down to the social, emotional connection as well. Because some of our students kind of lost that connection, not having that adult being there one-on-one. We had to get out in the community. We had to show them that, hey, we're still here. You know, even though the school doors are closed, communities and schools, your principals, your teachers, your counselors, and social workers, we're still here. And so in Southern Nevada, like I said, we put together so many initiatives. And another initiative that we worked on that I was really proud to be a part of as well was Connecting Kids. And that actually allowed us to connect over 120,000 students here in our district with Wi-Fi and laptops. So now every student is connected. You know, like I said, it was really a collective effort. It was really nice and neat just to see everybody come out. And I remember being in the food drives and putting like 3 to 4 weeks of food in people's cars, you know, for them and their neighbors who couldn't make it to the food drives. And just coming together and, you know, just being out there with council members, principals, local restaurant owners, social workers, counselors, everybody in the community was really coming together to kind of put this thing together. And, you know, like I said, I was really proud and just really great to see what our community could do. You know, this pandemic really did hit us hard, but I think us as an organization, we kind of hit it harder. So I'm really proud to be a part of this organization here.
Wow. I'm just humbled, Whitney, to hear all the work that you've done and that the community really rallied around our students and their families during this difficult time. So just, you know, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for all you do. I'd like to end our panel by asking each of you just to take a moment and look toward the future. A year, maybe 3 years from now, what would it look like if we're successful in this work to engage students in their learning, provide them, address the needs of the whole child and of the family? And more importantly, if we are able to create equitable learning conditions for all students, what would that mean? So what is your vision of the future, and again, what would change? So Ray, I'll start with you.
Well, Heather, that's a big question, but let me pull from what Whitney just described in such beautiful terms, which is that this pandemic hit our community hard, and we had to hit harder as an organization. I think when I consider what is going to have to happen over the next year, several years, it reminds me of this commercial of office supplies that maybe some folks in the audience are familiar with, where they advertise this easy button, where you buy this easy button. This is, you hit this button, it solves all problems. I'm concerned that policymakers, that those who are investing in programs, if we're going to get this equity and inclusion piece right, that if we care about learning something from this lesson that's been uncovered, we have to admit what is true and what is true about the way that public education has been built. And look, I'm a proud product of Texas public schools and a product of public education, but we can admit that public schools and public education wasn't built for all students, especially for the growing population of students who are suffering and living through poverty. That's going to be hard. And for us, I'm excited that we're in 2,900 schools, all Title I schools, but there are 80,000 Title I schools across the country that don't have integrated student supports or a site coordinator like Whitney or Mrs. Reyes, who I found. And so we can't just get lucky, like I was lucky to find communities and schools. We have to really work on the entire system. And I think we have the right intentions. And we just have to avoid hitting the easy button. So I have hope that we won't hit the easy button.
Thanks, Ray. David, what's your vision for the future for education? What would you like to see change?
Well, thank you. But it's everything that Ray said. And I'd add on that in 3 years, we won't be fully there. We want to be as close. But that's one of the things is there are no short-term fixes. But at the same time, from the beginning, every young person needs to have a Whitney. Every young person needs to have a Mrs. Reyes. And ideally, it's not just one, but the teachers are experienced in that way. And that what I would hope is that teachers and educators as a whole, including CIS staff, see every young person as somebody whom, if they're provided with the right opportunities and support that really deal with the types of issues that Whitney has talked about in a cohesive and integrated way, not only can succeed in school, but can thrive and develop the types of skills and knowledge and connections to other humans so that they can live successfully in the future and be powerful community members.
Thank you, David. So Whitney, we'll give you the last word on this. What would you like to see education look like in the future? What would you like to see changed?
You know, when I was out delivering food, I was in a community that I usually don't work in because I work on the other side of town. And I met this student. He ran up to me. I had on my CIS shirt, and he said, "You work for CIS?" And he recognized the symbol. He said, "My site coordinator works in my school. And, you know, I just need like a quarter to wash my clothes." And he was out with his younger brother. That reminded me when I was a young kid, you know, growing up, and I got into CIS as well. So I had a site coordinator just like Ray. And what I see changing is putting a site coordinator possibly in every school. If not a site coordinator, maybe a teacher, you know, somebody to give that kid a relationship and just give every student the same opportunities. That's what I see for our future.
Wow. Well, thank you. I want to thank all of you, Whitney, David, and Ray, for participating in this conversation. A lot of work ahead of us, but a lot of great work happening on the ground now. For those of you watching, we'd like to invite you that if you're interested in accessing any of the engagement tools that CIS and AIR co-developed, we invite you to visit our website at communitiesinschools.org, navigate to the K-12 opportunities page, and please feel free to download your free copy of our engagement tools. Thank you, and be well, everyone.